All right. I'm going to stop messing around because we've got a great speaker that I'm really excited about. And it's Brother Vincent Yeager. He's a local guy. He actually grew up in Patton, which is 8 miles from here. And he graduated from Penn State Altoona with a degree in electromechanical engineering. So he's kind of like us. He's held engineering internships at an electrical power equipment shop in Altoona, and he also worked for the Idaho National Labs. That's the Department of Energy. It's one of their nuclear facilities. That's a pretty big deal. He also worked in undergraduate research in combustion and energetic materials. Yes, he knows rocket science. He's turned down 2 job offers from the Franciscan Friars.
Oh, before that.
In August 2011.
For engineering.
He's going to explain that later, or in a minute, I guess. Yeah. He has progressed through 5 years of the Franciscan Formation Program. He's currently pursuing a master's degree in divinity from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., which is a great school. He's on track to be a Catholic priest in 2018 or 2019. So here at St. Francis, he works in campus ministry. He's here with us, and he's going to do some work in engineering, helping us out, and then he's going to return to Washington, D.C. to finish his studies. In his free time, I don't know how he has any, but in his free time, he enjoys playing sports, fixing things, playing guitar, hiking, camping, and rock climbing. So Brother Vince is in a really unique position as an engineer and as a Franciscan to talk to us about the environmentalism of St. Francis. And I'm really excited today because I think he can bring a very unique perspective to our seminar. So please join me in welcoming Brother Vince.
Okay, so thanks very much. Dr. Goodwill invited me to speak because he expressed an interest in St. Francis, which is fitting, being our namesake of the school here. And I suppose some of you are wondering about my little shift in life from engineering to being a friar. Right? It's a little bit odd, 2 jobs and making that transition. So my backstory, I was raised Catholic, went to church and everything. But towards the end of college, through high school, I wasn't that interested anymore. I was like, I'm too cool for that. I don't have to do that. But then in college, it really became important to me in my life, and it formed me, it helped me to get through undergrad, which was just crazy. So I know what you guys are going through. And after that, my senior year, it's April, so right at the end of the semester, I had a job offer before Christmas, would have been down in Knoxville, Tennessee, working for Bechtel Power. And then another one would have been in February, got the better offer, just south of Pittsburgh in Canonsburg, for Metso mining and materials equipment, so bulk material handling. A lot of hydraulics, heavy equipment, things like that. So the funny thing is that all this was shaping up and my life was on this track and it was working out perfectly. It's like, get these internships, got this job, doing everything I've ever really wanted. Yet I go on this come and see, so I start to think about the religious life, which is, as I am as a Franciscan, that's what it is. And it became interesting. I was kind of uneasy with what I was doing before, and it didn't make sense why I was uneasy, because everything was working out. And I started to look at this different life, and it just kind of clicked with me. It started to make a lot of sense. And as I got to know about St. Francis, it made more and more sense to me what happened to me. So his life actually has a pretty significant parallel, which I'll get to in a minute. But I went on the come and see to Loretto, visited the community, and it made sense. So I had this engineering opportunity in this hand, and it was great. It was a great opportunity. And yet, this religious life opportunity just kind of outshined it, like the sun coming in front of a tree. So I'm looking at this tree before me, and it's great, but the sun comes behind it and just dwarfs the tree. I see a silhouette, it's still a good thing, it's a great thing, and I still hope to be able to use it. But the religious life side of it became so attractive to me that there were no qualms at all. So it's this really beautiful thing for me, a profound transition where I just was able to say, well, I'm not going to take these jobs because this is where I feel called to go. Okay, so St. Francis. Who was he? Because the only people we know that look like Francis other than me on campus are this guy from the 1980s and this guy who you'll see tonight at the football game. Right? Well, it's not really Francis himself. So Francis was from the 1200s, so he goes way back, 800 years. And we get a little bit of a perspective on it because we'll go into that here in a moment. But it's just there's a stark contrast from this to this. He's a really intense guy, but oftentimes we paint him as this bird bath type. He lives in the garden. Yeah. So today I'm hoping to dispel that a little bit. Francis is, and always has been, very integral with a love of creation, a love, and whenever I say creation, whether you believe in God or not, what I'm speaking about is all that exists, all the environment, the universe, everything that exists is within that context. And it applies both ways. So the bird bath, right? And there's also the story of Francis the wolf tamer from Gubbio. So how many of you are upperclassmen? You were here at least when Cafe Gubbio was still around, right? Okay, so that is where that comes from. It's this little province in Italy. And Francis goes, and I'll tell you the story in a little bit more detail later, but he tames this rabid wolf that's terrifying the populace. We have Francis, who's painted as the rebel. People can oftentimes, because Francis, so it's a really interesting thing about Francis is that he is such a intriguing figure. Because he stands in stark contrast to everything else of the world of that time. So he's living in this context of the history in Italy, 1200s, feudal state. There's all this tension between these city-states. Everybody's trying to vie for power. There's all this economic turmoil, middle classes growing up, and the people in power are starting to lose some power in this tension. He stands in the middle of this man he was a short man. He was thin, he was sickly, and he gives up everything. That is what this picture's about. So this is Francis. He goes, his history of his life is he decides he wants to go to war. He wants to go to battle, become a knight, have this victorious battle image in his mind, wear armor, have a horse. And yet, while he goes, he has this profound experience of himself. He sees himself, and God reveals this to him because Francis wants glory. Really? Okay, so everybody wants, it's attractive. Everybody wants this little bit of people to look at them, to say, oh, like, good job, right? It's a good thing, right? I want that. I want people to say, good job. But Francis has this experience where God speaks to him in a dream and says, well, what's the most glorious thing? To serve the master or the servant? He says, well, obviously it's the master. And Francis, in that response, is being truthful. And the Lord says in this dream, well, why are you following the servant? Because Francis had gone off to battle, to the Crusades, following this count, hoping to be able to become a knight in his entourage and receive glory in this way. So Francis returns to Assisi. And after a time, he goes into the city square and gives up everything he has, down to all of his clothes. So he was in the sort of an honorary class within the Assisian society. And by giving up his clothing, as you can see, he's divesting himself of all the prestige, of all the honor, of all the privileges that his class, the merchant class, had. So he's reducing himself to the lowest place, to the poor. So he stands in the middle of this milieu, and You don't know anybody else's names from the 1200s, hardly. Yet Francis of Assisi is prevalent in every culture in the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who would say anything bad about him. Any religion, any culture, Francis stands apart. Now, the contractor. So this is to dispel that he was like this like guy who wasn't willing to do anything. Didn't just wander around through the fields and the flowers and dance around. That wasn't him. So after this dream that he had, he's going around and he's praying in these different churches, and he has this experience of prayer again. Very prayerful guy. And the Lord says, Francis, rebuild my church, for it's falling into disrepair. Now, we have to remember, he's Italian. So how many here are Italian, have Italian heritage? Anybody? Okay, you got a little bit? So the stereotype holds true for Francis, at least. He's a passionate guy. He's excitable, he's impulsive, he gets into things a lot. And he hears this, and he starts and he takes rocks from this disrepaired church and starts rebuilding the church. So just makes a decision and goes for it. Later on, he finds out it's a bit more involved. It's to rebuild the church at large, the people, to build up the culture of the church. He's a warrior, as we said. He's a poet. That's the Italian coming out again. He's a lover of nature, which is what we're going to focus on. Lover of God and the patron saint of ecology that Pope John Paul II made in 1979. So there's this influence that he's still having today. I mean, in the life of the church, 1979 is not that long ago, 2,000 years. So, 1182 to 1226, he only lived to be in his 40s. To think that, okay, so this man lived that long ago. There were people who were following him. Brothers in Ireland came over to the United States and set up this school because of his influence. That's significant. So there's a lot of tension in the Roman Catholic Church at that time. There are councils where they're reforming a lot of things. He's a warrior, so that Italy wasn't established as a country at that point. There were all these cities, these little fortresses. Everybody had their own army, and they were all vying for power. And he's out of the middle, cloth merchant. Okay, so now with that, we have the historical context of Francis, who he was, at least a little bit. And over here on the left, we have a picture. It's a painting in Assisi of Greccio. So St. Francis saw the entire world through this idea that it's a gift. So the entire world, because he didn't make it, he received it. He's a part of it. So that's this interplay. And he became so overcome by that reality because of what he saw with the incarnation. Okay, so that what I mean by the incarnation is the Catholic view, the belief that God became man in Jesus Christ. And it's significant because if you think about it, if you had different faiths have the view that God is purely spiritual, right? God is a spirit. And if God made the world and entered into that as a part of that creation, that's a point. That's a really, really powerful thing. So that colors all of what Francis has done, what he believes, what he thinks, how he views everything. So it's this lens that he sees everything through. And that is why he had such an impact. So here on the right is the town of Greccio, which is up in the mountains. And Francis, this was so important to him that he is the first person to establish the use of a nativity scene. Okay, so you see them all over the place. If you go to the chapel, we have one on display all the time. And he set it up because he wanted to use real animals, real people, and to express to people what this really meant, to convey his worldview. And with that is the whole life of Christ comes into play. Because I would be bashing Francis if I didn't mention all of this, because it's who he is. And it's what defines Francis, because it gives him a perspective on life. It gives him a joy that he's known for. It gives him this willingness to sacrifice everything that he has. He gave up all of his money, all of his power, because of Christ. Okay, so, because of this, so Francis is driven by this vision in his life. He sees everything, and humanity is a part of this ecology. And he views all people in a particularly caring way. So, how many of you have heard of leprosy? Okay. So another name for it is Hansen's disease. It still exists today. It's minimal, and it's only in like really, really poor societies. But it's a bacterial infection that affects your nervous system, and eventually it causes your skin. You develop a lot of really problematic issues, and eventually infection takes over, and it's hard to treat. And back in Francis's day, before antibiotics, it was untreatable. So these people were exiled at that time, because otherwise, if they were in and around society, it was contagious to some extent. It would be spread, and they faced the plague all the time. So this was just a smaller, less rapid spreading version of that. So we'll go back to this picture in a second. But at that time, there was this experience, this process of seclusion that happened. That's very, very similar to a funeral rite. So the leper would be led by the priest to the church. He would be sprinkled with holy water, make his confession. He would kneel beneath a black cloth while the priest said mass. Then sprinkled with 3 spades full of earth, so being buried. The imagery is really, really incredible. 3 spades full of earth, declaring, "Be thou dead to the world, but alive again to God." The formal exclusion deprived the leper of his civil rights. He became a non-person. Okay, so that's the culture he's in. And Francis writes himself. He wrote quite a bit, and he writes himself about how the lepers made him nauseous. He didn't even smell them. From a distance, seeing them made him nauseous. So he has this utter revulsion for these people. And it was acceptable within the culture because they were excluded. They were put in these colonies far away. They had to wear bells, go around wearing these cloaks, yelling out "unclean" as they walked around. But after Francis's conversion, he begins to see through this lens of the incarnation, and he's overcome one day. He sees a leper, and he gets off of his horse, and he goes to the leper, and he kisses the leper's hand. Because he's overcome by the humanity of the person that he's facing. It goes for all the poor. He started to see everything in a new light. So Francis, this is rewinding a little bit. Francis he has this experience, and he comes across a poor knight. This is before he divested himself. He had armor. He was coming back from the battle. He sees this poor knight on the side of the road, this man who's in the honorable class in authority within Assisi. He's a poor man. And that's disgraceful in that society. So Francis gets off his horse, and he gives him his armor, he gives him his cloak, he gives him the horse, so that he can honor this poor knight that he sees before him. Here's a bit more of a well-known story. So how many of you have heard of Francis and the Sultan? Just a couple? Okay, so Francis is, at this point, he's become the head of this religious community, and there's the cultural milieu, again, is the Crusades. So there's a lot of tension, historical debate back and forth. We're not going to make a point on that. But what we're going to talk about is that Francis went to Egypt, where the Crusades were happening at that point. Okay? And there's tension, obviously, it's war, back and forth, and it's 1200, so it's all hand-to-hand, it's all weapons, handheld weapons. And he goes as a man without weapons. He goes as a man of peace. And he respects the Sultan, who's in charge of the Muslim army, and he goes to him peacefully. And they have a conversation. So all this is to speak that Francis, through this lens of the Incarnation, sees humanity, and he sees all of creation in this new way. Okay, so now we're moving to the environment, which is kind of the pièce de résistance that you've all been waiting for anxiously. So now we're getting to it. So a particular reason why Francis and the environment and everything are so important is revealed in the Franciscan Goals of Higher Education that you guys get freshman year. And you maybe hear about time and again, but we just want to touch on it. Is that one part of the Franciscan Goals of Higher Education states, in part, we care for the earth, which is our home, and work to protect and preserve it for future generations. So there's this sort of responsibility that we take on. So Francis and the wolf at Gubbio. Anybody heard this story? Okay, got a couple. So, briefly, Francis goes to this small town in Gubbio, in Italy, and there's this wolf that's ravaging the fields. It's taking all the, so there's animals. They're raising sheep and cattle, and this wolf is ravenous and is eating those animals. And then what happens is the wolf starts attacking people, too. So it's not just animals that are happenstance in the way. So there's this violence happening, and the village people are terrified. They don't leave the town unless they're dressed for battle, because they're so terrified of this wolf. Now Francis and his brothers come along to Gubbio, and they're preaching. And the town, he hears about this wolf. They're telling the story, and Francis, overcome with zeal, as usual, the Italian again. And he goes out and he says, I'm going to preach to the wolf. So it's kind of he stands as an odd individual in some respects, because animals don't speak back. Yet he goes. And the townspeople are terrified. They figure out Francis is dead. He's done for. That's it. It's over. Party's done. Now this all comes from this little book, The Little Flowers of St. Francis of Assisi. So we have to remember it's maybe a little bit exaggerated in some points. Okay, it's important to remember. But it carries on a lot of attention. So there's something to it. And Francis preaches to this wolf. He says, Brother Wolf, why have you terrorized these people so? Why have you contradicted the law of God and murdered people and animals that aren't wild and free, that are yours to take? And this wolf is running at him, jaws wide open, ready to attack him. Francis makes the sign of the cross, and the wolf stops running, curls up at his feet, and walks back with him to town. And Francis establishes this relationship between the wolf and the townspeople, that they're going to feed him and he's not going to attack them. So it's almost like it sounds like a fairy tale. But we can learn from it. Because there's this harmony between humanity and the environment, humanity and nature and the wild animals. And this is how we're used to seeing Francis, right? So we have a little bird feeder, and then Francis swimming in the bird bath. But this all actually comes from this story of Francis preaching to the birds. So there's the fountain right out in the middle of the mall, just out in front of us here. And really, so the story, again, all these are just passed down back and forth between different people for generations. But Francis is going around town to town preaching about Christ and conversion and convincing people of their sin, and they're beginning to live more faithful lives. And as they leave this town, he's preaching again, and these birds are chirping in the trees, making a ruckus, and people can't hear him because of the birds. And he says, Sister birds, Be silent until I'm done. Then you can make your noise. And they did. And then later he's going along, out of town, walking along the road, and he sees these birds in the trees. And he's Italian, once again, overcome with this emotion and zeal and passion to preach to these birds. All it is to encourage them to praise God. Because that's what fills his life. Back to this lens, that he sees everything through. That it's all a gift, it's all given, it's all in harmony. And God saw it as good. So Francis, at the end of his life, he only lived in his 40s again. At the end of his life, he decided to write this song. And it's important to note that this is actually one of the first documented writings in Italian that is had in anybody's possession today. So everything else at that point was written in Latin or some other dialect, but Italian as a whole was just being developed, and Francis wrote in that. But all of this ties together his perspective on life, so I'd like to read through it, because it's a really important thing, and this conveys who Francis is, and it kind of weaves it all together. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, and the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no human is worthy to mention your name. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor, and bears a likeness of you, most high one. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them clear and precious and beautiful. Praise be you, my Lord, through Brother Wind, and through the air, cloudy and serene in every kind of weather, through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. Praise be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love, and bear infirmity and tribulation. And blessed are those who endure in peace, for you, by you most high, shall they be crowned. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no one living can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Now, that's a translation, obviously. But the thing that's really, really incredible about this is that Francis, at the end of his life, was going blind. And yet he wrote this. He was sick all the time. And yet he was filled with enough joy to write this song. And it's because he saw the world as beautiful as it is, that it actually superseded his vision, his visible eyesight, that he had within his heart this connection to the earth, to the world. That he knew it was there. He knew it was beautiful, even if he couldn't see it. So this all kind of puts in context a little bit better these goals that we have as a Franciscan institution. It's a humble, generous attitude toward learning. So Francis was a humble guy. Reverence for all life and the goodness of all humanity. So that comes in, we have even a little story where Francis was walking on the road and he saw this worm on the road. And he chose to pick it up and move it off the road to take care of this life, rather than to step on it or to ignore it. Global vision. Francis traveled around, preached everywhere. Service to the poor and needy. Respect for uniqueness of individual persons, community of faith and prayer, spirit of simplicity and joy, and a Franciscan presence. So all these things are tied in with who Francis was, what he did, how he talked, who he talked to. Now, what it means for us. So there's a care that we are obliged with, a responsibility that we have, because we as human beings have a higher power. Talking in philosophical terms here, but what it means is that we have a skill set, an ability to reflect on our actions. We have the ability to see what is actually around us and to see what our actions are going to do. We're going to see what effects they have. So for example, if I go to a creek and dump some oil in the creek, that's going to have an effect. I mean, that's a really stark example, and especially for all of you. Right? But what it means is that we have a responsibility to think about that type of thing and realize that we are obliged to care for this gift that we've been given, because we're not rocks, we're not worms, we're not birds. We have a higher level and therefore a higher responsibility. We have care for humanity. So this is something that's a really important thing too, especially with the environment. Environmental engineering and all other aspects that interrelate to this is oftentimes those who are poor end up being taken advantage of. Sometimes there's, for example, mining right now going on in the Congo. They're mining for cobalt for lithium-ion batteries to make them more efficient. Problem is, sometimes these mining companies are taking advantage of the people that they are getting the cobalt from. So there's a responsibility that we have in caring for the environment that we also have to care for humanity. There's this harmony. Because if it's not good for humanity, well, it's not good for anything. Not good for us, because it's all a harmony. It all weaves together. And especially on the disadvantaged. There's another situation down in West Virginia. There's a plant. They produce these materials that are non-stick, so like Teflon-based things, non-stick skillets and such. But in the off chemicals that they release down the stream, it's actually causing cancer in the cattle that live there and the family that takes their water from the stream. So it's this balance, and we have a responsibility to care for it. So that provides us with this context, this sense of ethics that we can take from Francis, that gives us a guide that we can provide, that we can care, and that we can do well in the world. Thank you.
We've got some time for questions, so please ask questions. All right, I'll ask a question if no one else has one. When you relatively recently joined the Franciscan Order,
Yeah.
what was and you've learned a great deal about St. Francis, what was to you the most surprising thing or the most interesting thing out of all the things that you've told us so far?
I would say the most interesting thing was learning about Francis's divestment. So that he would take what he had, his power, his authority, his money, being from the middle class that was rising up because they had sometimes more money than the upper class, that he would get rid of all of that, and yet he becomes one of the most influential figures in the last 800 years, right? So it's kind of a strange thing, because oftentimes people would grasp for more power, grasp for more authority, more money, to try and have a bigger effect. But Francis shows that that's not always the case. That was the most interesting to me.
I can't help but think that I'm approaching 40 and I'm not going to have a school named after me. Anytime soon.
On the last thing, about care for people and care for the environment.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, those kinds of things come in kind of a package of trade-offs. So, like you mentioned, the lithium battery example. So, presumably, I don't know anything about lithium batteries. Presumably, if putting cobalt into them makes them more efficient, there's some good to humanity,
Yeah.
even the poor and needy, that
Mhm.
comes attached with that, right?
Exactly.
So does Francis offer any kind of useful guidance to those kinds of ethical decision-making dilemmas
Sure.
that engineers face on a regular basis? I know as an engineer,
Yeah.
if I put cobalt in this battery,
Yeah.
it's going to help people on one hand, but getting that cobalt is going to hurt some people.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So trying to make it a little bit concrete, like maybe a guide that we can use. And really what it comes down to is being mindful, being aware of what we're doing and what effects it's going to have. Obviously there are trade-offs in everything. If I drink the rest of this water, it's not going to be watering a tree that's going to grow, right?
Later it will.
Exactly. Okay, you got me there. You got me. Yeah, that's good. But regards to like this cobalt situation,
Yeah.
so what a guide would be is to be mindful of where this cobalt's coming from and how it's affecting the people that are mining it, how it's affecting their economy. So it can slow things down a little bit, which is oftentimes where the tension is, that we're always seeking to do things faster and better and more efficiently, which is great, but we have to maintain in that balance. It's all a harmony of, can we help these people in the Congo who are mining this cobalt so that they don't develop these birth defects in their children because they're being contaminated with these heavy metals? Because there are mining companies that are there that are doing a pretty good job, I would say. But it's the ones who are the artisan miners who are going in with hammers and shovels, digging holes in the ground, unorganized by a company, that are developing these symptoms. Yet these Chinese companies are dealing with or buying this cobalt from them and providing, but only paying them pennies on dollars or more. So it's this balance of just being aware of where things are actually coming from and what effect they're going to have. We can't be perfect, but we can do our best.
Any other questions for Brother Vince? Yeah, Jay?
How does growing up with like a scientific engineering background affect your like faith and stuff? Because a lot of times those two don't really go together.
Sure. Yeah, so it's been especially interesting for me going through seminary at this point, because I grew up, raised Catholic, 8 miles away, and so there was this faith instilled in me. And what I've acquired through study is realizing that they go together. Like faith and science fit. There is the tension. Obviously, there's going to be stuff regarding evolution, the questions of evolution. It's like, well, but faith doesn't preclude evolution. Like evolution's a possibility. It only precludes saying that God's not involved. So there's this, again, it's kind of trying to see things from other perspectives and see what's still a possibility. So saying that, okay, well, things change, but God had a role at some point, at least. At a minimum, with that, you can maintain faith. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask one more question?
Go for it.
Okay. So Pope Francis has made some statements that signal a shift in the way the Catholic Church views environmental issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Significantly, climate change being perhaps one of them,
Yeah.
and some others as well. How does that read from someone that's in the same community, and are those things that you would say Francis, the person, would also be doing if he were still with us?
So would Francis be in accord with Pope Francis?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking you, does Pope Francis, I mean, he chose that name, right?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
informing his environment, is that informing the current Pope's environmentalism? And and to what extent do you think that these are good things, these are good changes in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I would say it's intentional. I would say they fit together. Because, so going back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, because Francis of Assisi was very, very aware of the poor and disadvantaged. And what we run into most often is the poor and disadvantaged being affected the most by any kind of environmental impact, because they can't afford to get away. People in, for example, New Orleans, when Katrina hit, couldn't get away. I mean, they didn't have money even for a car. So there's this, I mean, there are more issues involved in that, but you have any kind of a situation, earthquakes, hurricanes, rising coastal waters, whatever, pollution. The people with money can fix it for themselves, and the people without are stuck. So there's this, with Pope Francis, there's this appropriation of St. Francis, an awareness of the environment, and awareness of people and how they fit.
If there's no other questions, let's thank Brother Vince for talking.